I'm joined by an extremely distinguished panel. We have a couple more speakers who are going to be coming in and going out. There's lots of things happening in DC this week. So my name is Niranjali Amerasinghe, and I'm the Executive Director of ActionAid USA. Just to do a little bit of scene setting, we find ourselves in a moment where many developing countries are facing multiple crises, whether it's climate shock or debt crisis, cost of living crises, regressions in gender equality. There are many difficult things that developing countries are dealing with right now. And there are several ways in which the international financial institutions of today have either contributed to those crises or are not doing enough to help developing countries lift out of those crises. Many financial institutions have put forward austerity policies, continue to give developing countries onerous debt that they are finding it very difficult to get out of, and often will push them into more carbon-intensive industries that then fuel the climate crisis and then in turn cause more debt because countries have to borrow in order to deal with the shocks. I'm reminded that the Bretton Woods institutions, the very first conference was 80 years ago, and that was at a time post-World War II, just on the cusp of decolonization, and those power dynamics are very much embedded in what we see today, and that needs to change. So in particular, the US has a strong role to play in these financial institutions. It's a major stakeholder, it's a major power that has significant voice in these institutions. So we're here today to talk about what the US can also do in this context to help improve the situation for developing countries. So I'm going to introduce each panelist as they come so that we can keep on top of things. I'm going to start with Iyabo Masha. Iyabo is the director of the Intergovernmental Group of 24 on International Monetary Affairs and Development, or the G24. It represents the interests of developing countries at the IMF and the World Bank. Prior to this, Dr. Masha worked at the IMF for over 20 years. She joined the IMF from the Central Bank of Nigeria and was a member of Nigeria's Presidential Economic Advisory Council from 2019 to 2021. Over to you, Dr. Masha.
Thank you very much for the very warm introduction, and thank you to SIPA for inviting me for this session. I think a good way to start is to ask why we think debt resolution or debt relief is important. And indeed, we do have an example of what happened in the past at the turn of the century when the developing countries were very highly indebted and the HIPTIC and the MDRI initiatives were introduced. We see what happened after that. Many countries had a fresh start, a new lease of life, and for that reason, they were able to introduce new policies, meet goals on education, on health, and on development. So over the next decade, more than 1 billion people were taken out of poverty, and the world was like on track to meeting some of these goals. But sadly, a lot of those progress has been reversed because of COVID-19, because of the slowdown in global economic growth, but more importantly, because these countries accumulated substantial debt over the period. Now, it's not that the reason it's not that the countries were loose in policies, but there was also an environment of loose monetary policies from advanced economies. And so there was a lot of interest in pushing debt instruments, I would say, to developing countries. So the situation we have now is that over the past 10 years, there's been something in the region of 54% of GDP increase in debt across all developing countries. And even though at the end of COVID, only about half of developing countries were at risk of debt distress, but what we have now is that almost all of them are at risk of debt distress. So the situation is very dire. There are many frameworks going on. The debt resolution, the common framework, the G20 common framework is one of the frameworks that have been introduced by developing countries, the G20, to at least put some kind of resolution on the tables, some kind of debt relief. But what we see in this is that it's not working well for many countries. Many countries are not even coming forward to take advantage of it. And that's because it takes a very long time for them to resolve their issues. The relief they get is not much, and many organizations, many creditors are not participating. So what we have then is really too little, too late. So I think this is this tells us that the whole debt resolution framework, sovereign debt resolution framework, has to be reinvented, has to be changed so that countries can get timely and comprehensive relief. All creditors should be encouraged to participate. The multilateral development banks, World Bank, IMF, they are not participating. And more than 40% of low-income countries' debt are owed to the World Bank. So if they are not participating and these countries continue in this kind of high debt environment, there is really no prospect for growth. And some of the challenges we see, both on the side of development goals, but also on meeting climate goals, being able to address issues like desertification, even migration. These issues need substantial resources, which is not available because they have maxed out their credit card as it were. So what we are calling on is for the US to take a leadership role. The US essentially has what I would call a veto power in the Bretton Woods institutions by virtue of the size of its quota, but it also has the global leadership to be able to push for the kind of reforms that other countries may be reluctant to implement or may be reluctant to support. So one way to do this is first the sovereign debt resolution framework. There has to be something that is institutionalized because it's beginning to look like every few years the world is going to go through some wave of debt crisis. And it would be good to have a permanent resolution. As a matter of fact, the US government did support something like that at the IMF around 2005, but it didn't materialize. So I hope this time around we can make enough effort, the Congress can make enough effort to ensure that there's a framework that works for all countries, that works for creditors and also the debtors. Secondly, the US can also use, based on financial support, provide financial support for some of these countries. The US government has a very large international development budget, and these are some of the areas in which the US Congress can help to ensure that whatever requests are made to support developing countries as they go through this difficult time, so to ensure that such requests are approved. Finally, it is important for the US, also the Congress has to be part of it, to ensure that whatever new debt resolution framework is going to succeed the current one is comprehensive, that the private sector participates, and that the World Bank and the IMF participate. I think that is the only way in which we can expect something that makes difference to the developing for the developing countries. Secondly, there is need for a mechanism that would support countries that are not at debt distress. They have liquidity challenges. They are and we want to be able to support them before a liquidity challenge becomes a solvency problem. And what we're seeing now is that more than 20% of the instruments of countries with market access are trading at below market rates in the international market. And I think last year, 2023, 18 countries lost access to the financial market. So these are the kind of countries that, yes, they have liquidity challenges, but they can sustain their debt. But there's an unwarranted decline in the price of their bonds, and that does not have to do with their domestic macroeconomic policies. It has to do with what is coming in from the external environment. So this is the area in which so two areas, one for countries that are highly indebted and that need relief, and the other one for countries that have strong fundamentals but need liquidity support. And I think I will stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Masha, for walking us through the. All right, we're going to move over to Dr. Bardouille. She is a special advisor on climate resilience in the office of Barbadian Prime Minister Mia Mottley and the director of the Bridgetown initiative, a much celebrated agenda to transform the global climate finance architecture. Prior to this role, Pep was a resilience lead with the International Finance Corporation's upstream infrastructure department and was founding CEO of the Climate Resilience Execution Agenda for the UNGA. Could you walk us through some of the reforms that you're seeing as essential?
Good morning and lovely to meet you all. And I'm honestly deeply honored to be part of this panel. And it's always difficult to go after illustrious speakers. Thank you so much to Dr. Masha for the part that I was able to capture. Look, I think sometimes it's helpful to bring things down to a country level, right? We're often up in the clouds and for good reason, but I think without illustrating why we're doing all of this, sometimes we get a little bit lost in the problem. So the reason we're doing all of this is that we are trying to make a difference in the lives of people who deserve dignity, and we are trying to stem a crisis which is going to affect all of us, not just those in the developing world, as we will have seen recently in Florida. Passing the hurricanes, Milton and Helene, devastation and destruction is absolutely insane. And that is going to have a knock-on effect at multiple levels. I think it might be helpful for you to understand how that affects the average individual, including in the United States, where you have a constituency that needs to believe and buy into this thing. I don't know how many of you actually live or own a property in Washington, D.C. I got a shock in June this year when my insurance premium for a small row house, I went up 40% this year. And it's a small row house in Georgetown. It's not exposed to anything. There's not a lot going on, not a lot of crime, not a lot of anything, and certainly not a lot of apparent climate change. And I didn't realize, so I said 40%, and the broker said, but did you not see that it went up 20% last year? I didn't even notice because I wasn't paying attention to the bill. There's a direct debit. So 60% in the past, essentially 14 months. So that's one thing. The second thing is that Zillow has now followed Redfin in indicating climate vulnerability in their listings. So there's going to be an impact, not just on your insurance, but ultimately, because insurance prices, together with everything else that you pack into your monthly fee, affects how much you can afford, and therefore it will have an impact fundamentally on house prices, which then affect your equity. And we all know that intergenerational wealth, in a large part, is created through property ownership. So there is a knock-on effect on the lives of people every day across all markets, and certainly palpable, even here in Washington, D.C., which is not, exposed to the types of crises we've seen just in the past couple of years. So I think that's important to understand. So why does this matter from kind of an economic but also a financial perspective? And the reason I say that is that we often scaremonger and say, if you don't do this, you're going to have a ton of climate refugees. Yes, that's part of it, but on an immediate level, you're actually going to have a decline in your own individual wealth. Now, let's extrapolate that to a developing country. Let's take that to a climate vulnerable country. I come from Dominica, a climate vulnerable country that was hit by a Category 5 hurricane in 2017. We lost 226% of our GDP overnight. Now, admittedly, Dominica is a small country, so $1.2 billion translates to 226% of GDP. But how do we recover from losing 226%. It's very, very difficult, right? And I think this is where we start to speak about some of the points that Dr. Masha has mentioned and other panelists will mention, which is that we need access to more cheaper, longer term financing to build adaptation. And that's one of the core points within the Bridgetown initiative. Without access to that, you're not able to fund adaptation initiatives, which are critical while we are working very hard to push for a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that's one thing. But where is all that money going to come from? So it's important to look at alternative sources of financing. Barbados co-chairs the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force, and that additional pot of financing is one of the pieces that's mentioned in the Bridgetown initiative. But another piece relates to SDR, several $billion dollars, magic money that have come through the IMF through its wonderful articles of whatever, sorry, exactly, where essentially you can create these pots of money that can address global challenges. And we were incredibly lucky to see the impact of $650 billion issuance of SBIs during the global pandemic, the COVID pandemic, but the climate crisis, I would argue, is going to hit many of us in many more ways over the next few years. So that is a potential pot of money that could be used to not just shore up individual economies, but to rechannel resources to the multilateral development banks, for example, the African Development Bank, that can then in turn take that magic money and multiply it by 4 by going to the markets and then on lending to developing countries. So I think there's a number of these areas. We also need to look at emergency liquidity in the aftermath of a disaster. Again, giving you an example, passage of Hurricane Beryl in July this year. There are instruments within the multilateral space. The World Bank has catastrophe deferred drawdown options, a CAP DDO, which allows countries, in the aftermath, if they have a program in place, to get a certain portion of their GDP as emergency liquidity. But Barbados, St. Vincent, and Jamaica did not have a CAP DDO in place. Only Grenada did. And therefore, in the aftermath of Beryl, they did not have access to that liquidity, and they now have to go and negotiate how we get this. So there are a number of things that can be done, both low-hanging fruits, such as, negotiating instruments for liquidity, emergency liquidity, and higher hanging, more politically tricky solutions, which is, how do we create solidarity levies? How do we reallocate fossil fuel subsidies, which are of the order of trillions of dollars every year? So we're putting billions into mitigation and adaptation and trillions into fossil fuels. We need to rebalance that. And it can be done in a way that does not destroy the current order, but also allows much more resource to flow where it is needed. And then things like SDIs, which are, doable. They're an instrument that's tried and tested, that's had impact and that works, and is actually there to solve these types of problems. So I would say that Bridgetown is a movement. We're not, institutionalized as the G24. We're a movement that has tremendous support from civil society, but we also, I think, have a very powerful voice to Prime Minister Iyabo and Martín, who I have a pleasure and privilege to serve, and a growing number of global South leaders and countries that are recognizing that we have got to speak with a single voice. And that single voice does not only benefit us, I would argue that it benefits the global North as well. And so I think we need to look at the Bridgetown initiative and what we're running for as an opportunity for us to begin to change things for everyone's benefit and in everyone's interest. I think, there are other parts of Bridgetown, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at our website, bridgetowninitiative.org, where you will see the documents in detail that are more, well understood. The loss and damage fund, for example, is one. The World Bank has a number of programs that we're asking to be scaled up. But I would argue that the biggest ones are around recognizing that if we don't shift the system, the impact will be felt globally, and that there are chances to do that at the very short term with absolutely no pain.
Thank you so much. I'm about to lose both women. Both Doctors Masha and Bardouille have to leave. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be here, for sharing your valuable expertise. Let's just give them another round of applause. Thank you. Over to Andrés Arauz, who is going to talk about, I think, largely IMF and their issues, but I'll let you kind of go and have it you want to focus on Andrés Arauz is a senior research fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Prior to joining CEPR, Andrés was General Director of the Central Bank of Ecuador and later was appointed Minister of Knowledge and Human Talent. What a fantastic ministry. I just talent. Wow. Andrés was also a presidential candidate for.
That's a very talented guy.
I'm sorry, can you pass this for me? I did not check this before. Gobierno de Revolución Ciudadana. Okay, all right. Andrés.
Thank you, Niranjali, for that introduction. Yeah, that was only the second best job title that I had. The best one was Deputy Secretary for the Planning of the Good Life.
Oh,
Planning the future, alternate metrics, not just monetary metrics, but
fantastic.
environmental and material-based metrics for planning the development of our country. But yeah, thank you for inviting me here. Thank you everyone for being here. I basically wanted to touch upon SDRs, the special drawing rights, which is this mysterious magic money that Kev already mentioned. But it is really not that magical and very straightforward and absolutely crucial in the current international financial and monetary system. So in the 1960s, in the midst of monetary crisis, the Bretton Woods institutions and the countries decided to create this new reserve currency that would allow for more flexibility in the international monetary system. And they decided to create this instrument called the special drawing rights. At the time, they used to call it paper gold. Was going to basically replace gold as the means of settling international payments and become an international currency. In fact, in the Articles of Agreement, which is like the international treaty of all monetary affairs and by which the International Monetary Fund is guided on, it says that the mandate for the IMF and all the countries in the world is to make the SDR the prime international reserve asset. So basically, there's a mandate to make it an important asset so that countries can base their international transaction reserves in that unit. Now, the IMF, when it decides to create or issue SDRs, it doesn't take money from somewhere else to create them. It does not require the United States to underwrite them or to, raise taxes or to get into deeper deficit. No, all of the ways that you can create more SDRs have to do basically with a political decision where the board of governors of the IMF meets, so basically the representatives of all 190 countries, and they decide that we should have more money, we should have more SDRs, and it's allocated to every country in the world that's an IMF member. Now, this is extremely important and extremely crucial because it means, just as Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, said a few years ago, that there is no such thing as shortage of money for example, the climate crisis, that we have the available resources as a planet to collectively solve the major problems of our society, of humanity in general. Now, the problem then becomes only the political will to make it happen. But in terms of the technical design, the accounting design in general, it exists there to provide the solutions. Now, the US plays an absolutely key role in this because the international treaty says that in order to get the SDR issuance approved by the Board of Governors, you need 85% of votes. And the United States has 17% of the votes at the IMF, which means it has veto power. If the US is not on board, no SDRs will happen. That is why we are here, and that's why it's important that the United States has the political will to support the zero tax, deficit-free, debt-free, and conditionality-free way to support countries in distress without the lengthy political delays of either budget appropriations or new international treaties. You know, how many decades have we been talking about green taxes or global green taxes? You know, decades with zero results. How many decades have we been talking about these redistributive mechanisms to finance the climate crisis? You know, with zero results or with very meager and tiny results. While with SDRs, we've had effective transfer of wealth and creation of resources that has favored developing countries. Some of the criticism that usually comes from allies against the SDRs is that 2/3 of them go to the rich countries and China in the initial allocation. And that's true. And the distribution is skewed because it follows the voting power at the IMF. But it's not that bad because those rich countries in China don't really have any use for them anyway. They have their own currencies, they have tons of reserves anyway. It's the developing countries that get them that will actually make use of them. So we have to analyze not just the allocation distribution, but the use distribution, how the SDRs have been used. And when you analyze the use, SDRs have been used progressively. The poorer countries have used them the most. 41 out of the 45 sub-Saharan economies have used them. More than half of the Latin American and Caribbean economies have used them. And it means that they have been, in fact, used by the developing countries. And the thing is, when they use them, they usually exchange them for hard currency or they use them directly to pay for all debts to the IMF. In either case, especially when they exchange them for hard currency, they then use them to buy imports, whether they're capital goods or other types of goods, whereby even the developed countries that export those goods also benefit from that basically stimulus that goes to the world economy. So this is extremely important. It's basically an instrument that has a very, very, very few downsides to it and many important benefits. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what can be done with those 2/3 of the SDRs that have gone to the rich countries? Are we just going to leave them unused or parked somewhere in the balance sheet of central banks and so forth? Well, sure. I mean, it doesn't hurt to have them there, but maybe we can even make better use of them. And if the rich countries, you know, OECD countries, can transfer, for example, donate only 25% of their unused SDRs, you would have wiped out completely all of the developing countries' debts to the IMF. If you use 33% of rich countries' unused SDRs, you would have wiped out completely all of the IDA loan portfolio of the World Bank, which is the debt of the poorest countries in the world. So that's the potential that you have. But what happens now? That because of a accounting change that happened in the century by IMF staff, not even the board of governors or the executive board, but just the IMF statistical staff, they said that the SDR allocation, which is the counterparty to the holdings, had to be accounted as liabilities and not as equity. It may seem like a very, very wonky change, but the impact of that is that it now makes it more difficult for example, rich countries to either donate their SDRs to developing countries or to allow ministries of finance or ministries of the environment to access SDRs from the central banks. But it's not impossible. It can be done. And hopefully we can get into how we can make those swift and tweaks later on. Thank you very much for this.
Now we are going to move on to Martín Guzmán, who is a professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and alongside Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, is co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia Business School. He served as Minister of Economy of Argentina from December of 2019 to July of 2022, and is today a widely recognized expert in sovereign debt. and then crisis resolution. Martin, could you talk to us about the path forward that you see in resolving the debt crisis?
Absolutely. So first, let me thank you for the invitation and for the fantastic work that CEPR is doing, and also for the flexibility. I'm sorry I'm late, but it's good to be able to meet the commitments in the probably the busiest week of the year. And so I'm supposed to talk about that situation in the developing world. So let me begin with a diagnostic, an overview of what's going on, with what is supposed to complement Iyabo Masha's presentation. What's happening is that since 2022, since the war in Ukraine, we've seen a significant increase of debt payments from developing nations to its creditors. This is a fact that followed a process of 13 years in which developing nations were borrowing in a different global context than the one we have today. After the fall of Lehman Brothers and the quantitative easing policy from the US government and the EU, we saw money flowing to the south, searching for yields, looking for high returns. So countries that had never borrowed in international credit markets for the first time were able to place bonds, mostly in New York, mostly in New York and to some extent in London. And high interest rates, which basically acknowledged that there were risks. Well, the risks materialized. The combination of the pandemic and COVID-19 was a combination that led to debt distress in many countries. We are not seeing as many defaults as one would expect in the absence of other flows into the countries that I explained what that means, that are being used to pay private creditors mainly, and to a much lesser extent, China. But the big problem is with the private creditors. Why are we seeing that those as many defaults? Precisely because money from global taxpayers, there is money that goes to international financial institutions, is flowing into these countries and is being used to pay debts to mostly to the private sector. That's a bailout. So global taxpayers are bailing out Wall Street creditors. But we do see a significant increase in debt payments as a share of tax revenues, meaning that these countries are cutting on education, health, public infrastructure. They are suffering development crisis. That's what's going on. What we're going through is a massive development crisis in the South. And of course, it has social consequences. It explains the migration, disruption in the communities. The path forward needs to make sure that there is that the transfers from these countries in distress to the private sector stop. What we're seeing now is one more example, one more illustration of the procyclicality of international capital markets for the developing nations and counter-cyclicality for the advanced nations. What does that mean? It means that when the global economy creates liquidity, when there's a lot of money in the global economy, money flows to the developing nations. But once there's a negative shock, money flows back to the same. That's what we're seeing. And the solution requires that the money from international financial institutions is not used for bailing out private creditors, but on the contrary, is used for recovery policies, for growth policies, for counter-cyclical macroeconomic policies. We don't have good reasons to be optimistic now, because the main factor that explains why debt operations to resolve the problems of debt distress don't occur is the structure of incentives, is the way the international financial architecture works. So on the one hand, we have the creditors that, of course, they prefer to be bailed out. And if the IMF provides, or the other IFIs provide money to the countries for a bailout, that's the best they can get. And if there is no bailout, they still prefer to only accept unsustainable deals, meaning not enough debt relief just in case a positive shock occurs later on. Maybe there is a country discovers oil, and if the creditors already accepted a deeper deal, then they won't have the benefit of that positive shock. And on the countryside, there are what we call principal agent problems, meaning that many times the agent doesn't work for the principal. The principal is the people, the taxpayers. But sometimes you get a president or a finance minister that wants to work for the principal, but it doesn't have the power to do it. So the role of the IMF is critical. And the IMF is the staff of the IMF is risk averse. They are not bold. If they take risk, they are penalized, because what they are supposed to do is to produce what we call debt sustainability analysis that are sound, that they say this is amount of relief that the country needs. But if they say the right thing, they alienate everyone. But that's what they are supposed to do. They alienate the debtor, they alienate the creditors. So the norm in these processes is what we call the too little and too late. Not enough relief, and the process of debt restructuring to restore that sustainability, to resolve that crisis, start too late. And we see more and more troubles. So the key for the path forward is to change the structure of incentives. There are two key elements. The first one is what I said, the IMF role. The IMF is not doing enough now, far from that, far from that. But the role of the US Treasury is key. If the US Treasury doesn't, or if it penalizes a bold attitude from the IMF staff if the IMF staff wants to do the right thing and clash with private creditors, then there is no legitimacy to the policies, and creditors will feel that they have the power to do what they want to do, what they want to achieve, which is going to be contrary to what a resolution requires. The second key element in the current juncture is the legal frameworks that determine the compensation that creditors get when debts are in default under the UK law and New York law. New York compensates debts in default by an interest rate of 9%. So you pay 9% extra, you accumulate arrears at 9% when debt is in default. That rate was set in 1981 when inflation rate in the US was 8.9%. It never changed. Inflation is much lower now. And of course, for a creditor, if you continue accumulating arrears at 9%, that's a swift incentive not to participate in a debt deal. And on top of that, the legal frameworks don't penalize the behavior of buying debt in default with the intent of litigating against the issuer. That's a big problem. So changing the structure of incentives is going to be key. Let me offer two final remarks on two related issues. One of them has been raised by Andrés. The first one is the IMF surcharges. Thank you, CPR, for all the work you've done. It's a step forward. It's not enough, I would say far from enough for what's correct. What happened, the IMF modified its surcharge policy and interest rate policy that was penalizing countries in stress. But the fund adopted another decision, which is that it's going to use the money, the income that it makes from countries in crisis to subsidize lending to the low-income countries. This is called the PRGT facility. The PRGT at the IMF is a trust for lending to the low and low middle-income countries. And the reasons that off the record everyone gives is no, why are you going to charge countries in crisis to subsidize low-income countries? Well, we are being pragmatic. We don't want to go through the US Congress. That's the reason that off the record everyone gives, right? So that way, countries that are seeing an increase in poverty, an increase in unemployment, finance the low-income countries. And the final comments about special growing rights. I was captured by your comments on China. I was a finance minister of Argentina. So I can give you some. I mean, I'm not. And it's not that I defending U.S. interests here. I'm just telling you how reality works. When a country doesn't have any liquidity, the today the available option is China, and the SDRs, if they are available, give you one more option. So in 2021, Argentina had to meet a payment with the IMF of $4.5 billion, close to that. And basically, there were initially two options: to activate the swap with China and pay the fund, or default with the fund. But the IMF issued special drawing rights. So what did Argentina do? It used the special drawing rights to pay the IMF. Okay, so basically it disempowered China. So I don't understand. I really don't get that argument that about China and SDRs. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know what reality people are looking at. On the contrary, in 2023, I was no longer the finance minister. There was a similar situation. The fund had not approved a disbursement, so what Argentina did was to pay the fund, activating the swap with China. But once a country activates the swap with China, it uses it more extensively. And what can you buy with yuans? Chinese goods. So it diverts trade. Again, I don't mean to defend the US interest here. I'm just telling you how things are. I saw here.
I'm going to continue with this trend as I pass on to Mark. Mark Weisbrot is the co-founder and co-director of CEPR, Center for Economic and Policy Research, as you well know, an economics think tank based here in DC. He's the author of the book Failed: What the Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy, and co-author with Dean Baker of Social Security, The Phony Crisis, and has written numerous research papers on a range of domestic and international economic policy issues. Take us away, Mark.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody for coming here. And I like this panel, partly because people have already explained half the things that I have to explain, points that I have done. And also, I want to get back to planning the good life under. I've been fighting with the IMF for 25 years, and it's okay. I mean, we want something, right? Something very big, which was the issuance of SDRs, and that's why we're going to get another one. So I won't bore you with too much detail, but I think we have to look at this and look at how it happened, right? Because this was the biggest thing, in 2021. This was more than all the aid that developing countries got put together, and it had no loans and no conditions, unlike the majority of the other aid, including the climate aid, which was debt. And so this is really big thing to get. And how did it happen? Well, in March of 2020, Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, made a speech, and she proposed a major issuance of SDRs. First of all, she said that the developing countries were short about $2.5 trillion, and she used the term financing need, was the IMF term, basically has to do with countries not having enough to avoid balancing payments or other kinds of financial crises. So it was serious, and she said that was the low estimate. She said we could boost global. This is a quote. We could boost global liquidity through a sizable SDR allocation, as we successfully did during the 2009 global crisis. So what happened? U.S. Treasury Department put an end to the discussion immediately. And that tells you something about the institutions of global governance and the so-called rules-based international order that we have to change. And I'm going to get to that because Andrés made some really good proposals and for change within the IMF, the accounting changes that could really make a difference. And so I'm just going to give another way that we can make change, because I'm focusing on the U.S. Part of it, which is, and I have to do that because this is how we win in the short run. Okay. Okay. So anyway, that would have been the end of the discussion, but the U.S. House, many of you helped with, introduced a bill for 2.8 trillion coming off of the IMF estimate of what was needed. And more than 100 US organizations with tens of millions of members actually piled on. And so did 200 CSOs from around the world. And I think this was really a big fight between the majority of the world, and especially the interests of the billions of poor people, and the United States government with its rich country allies at the IMF. So for a short-term strategy, we need Biden to tell the Treasury to and to notify Congress. He has to give 90 days notice. Congress doesn't vote on this. That's one of the big advantages of this, right? And it'll be a big advantage for the next president if they want to do this, because it's one of the few things they can deliver without having to get something through the Senate. Okay, and so this didn't get through the Senate last time, but the pressure from the U.S. House was enough to win it, and that's important for the politics here. Now, in the longer run strategy, of course, besides the changes that people have already suggested, I think the SDRs are also important because if they become a more frequent issue, they have more frequent issuances, and it could even become a permanent thing, as many economists, including Joe Stiglitz, has recommended, and us too. You could possibly change the IMF over time, because one of the reasons why the IMF just defers to Treasury is that, I mean, this is 80 years already, right? This rules-based order was set up in 1946, and how long can this last as the world changes? And so, one of the reasons is that the people on the executive board are thinking, well, we can't fight this. There's no way we can win because they've had it until just recently. And so if this becomes something that the members can get a bigger stake in, right? This is a big stake. I mean, everybody gets a piece of this with no debt and no conditions. And then the IMF could change to an organization where the rest of the world plays a bigger role. And this is something important because, too often everything here is framed in terms of, what's good for the US and what helps the US, run the world. And that's not always good for us either. And that's why I'm glad that Andrés mentioned that the job creation here in the United States, I don't have time to go through all the numbers for that, but we've done the research on it, and it is very real. Okay, you got 100. Well, first of all, you got $1 trillion of imports in the developing countries that receive that 209 billion in special drawing rights when the Treasury does what it can do without Congress. Okay, and so it's very easy to see how that can create jobs in the United States. It's basically a 5% increase in their reserves, and a fraction of that is spent on imports, and that's all it takes. Every $1 billion, according to the International Trade Administration here, is 5,000 jobs in the U.S. So, we estimated the low estimate was like 125,000, but it would be hundreds of thousands of jobs, and it was already in 2021. So this gives us a means. I don't want to be too U.S. centric here, but this gives us a way of winning this in the United States and really winning something for people here as well. And so this is a very important thing from the point of view of really the United States and the world. And the other big change, I think, of this kind of, if we win this again, is what Martín mentioned as the pro-cyclicality of economic policy for developing countries versus the counter-cyclicality for the rich countries. And we can see that, of course, when the world recession hit in 2020, we ran 15% of GDP deficit, 10% the next year, and trillions of dollars of quantitative easing. And so what this would be is a small but very significant step towards recognizing and implementing the counter-cyclicality of macroeconomic policy, allowing some of this to take place more, as it did actually in response to the last issuance for the rest of the world. And finally, I want to say too that this is a matter of life and death for a lot of people. There are now the World Food Program estimates 309 million people are at risk of starvation. That's up from 276 million in 2022 and 135, so less than half that pre-pandemic. And the last issuance, I think, saved hundreds of thousands of lives. That's according to the estimates that the Bank for International Settlement gives for the relation between recessions and mortality. So this is really big, and it's a moral issue, I think. I want to end with that, okay? If people here can stop the US government from blocking, that's what they're doing really at the IMF. They're blocking something that everybody else wants that would save lives around the world. Then we have an obligation to do that, and I think we're going to do it.
All right, we're going to have concluding remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions. So Alex Main is going to give us some concluding remarks. Alex is the Director of International Policy at CEPA. His areas of expertise include IMF policy, economic globalization, and US policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean. Alex regularly engages with US and Latin American policymakers and works with civil society to reform global financial institutions and US foreign and international economic policy.
Thank you, Niranjali, and thank you all for being here and for sitting through all of these great but very wonky presentations. And I want to thank my incredible colleagues from CEPA for putting this all together. Despite injuries in some cases, that's the United for the injured, but true. And thank you as well to Chuy Garcia's office. I don't know if there's any staff here from the district office, but they were very supportive and helped us find this location. So thank you for that. And we've had a really great panel today talking about two enormous challenges for the global South: debt and climate, and talking about the role that international financial institutions should be playing. We focused on a key player, the IMF, which is supposed to be an anchor of global economic stability and to promote economic prosperity. And if that's the case, it's really not doing a very good job. For the last 15 years or so, through the global financial crisis, through the COVID pandemic, a lot of developing countries have had a much tougher time recovering economically compared to most wealthy countries. They've tried to keep up, but they've been hit by capital flight and by more and more debt. And they simply don't have the tools and resources that the US and other wealthy countries have, thanks to their influence over the global financial system. And we've heard from our panelists about how that system, in which the IMF plays such a central role, is failing the global South. And Dr. Masha spoke about how debt relief measures are too little and late. Dr. Bardouille about the knockoff effects of climate change that affect us all, including our home insurance, but particularly affect climate vulnerable countries, Dominica, Barbados, so many others that are hit by climate disasters, and that are unable to access affordable resources to deal with the aftermath of these disasters and to adapt to climate change. And instead, right now, we're at the risk of another horrific debt crisis, like the one in the late 1970s and 1980s, which massively set back growth and development throughout the global South. And today, there's a mountain of government debt approaching $100 trillion, according to the IMF, and a chunk of that debt, and particularly the debt owed by low-income countries, is owed to the international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. Scarce resources that should be invested in people and in addressing climate change are being used instead to pay off debt. But beyond this dire panorama, our panelists have brought hope to this discussion, concrete proposals of reform developed and supported by global South governments, development experts, and civil society coalitions. Some of them are here with us today. And Dr. Masha spoke, for instance, of a comprehensive debt resolution framework that includes debt to private creditors and to Bretton Woods institutions. And we saw some of that in the past with the HIPC initiative in the late 1990s. Nearly 40 low-income countries got debt relief. A number of them got debt cancellation, mostly African countries. And we need to see more of that. We need to see it extended to middle-income countries as well, to the entire global south that's suffering under the weight of high debt and high debt payments. The G24, which Dr. Masha coordinates, is called also for the elimination or substantial reduction of surcharges. And you may know that the reform, the IMF surcharge policy, was announced 10 days ago by the IMF. It was achieved thanks to the pressure from governments, from civil society, and US members of Congress, some offices here today that were very involved in the fight against surcharges. And it's a step in the right direction, but these unfair and counterproductive fees that the most indebted countries are forced to pay the IMF are absurd, and they must be ended. But Dr. Masha offered another, Dr. Bardouille offered another ray of hope, Bridgetown 2.0, which calls for debt workout mechanisms, incorporating climate and nature criteria in debt sustainability analyses, and calls for the use of IMF special drawing rights, repurposing them and reissuing fresh allocations of these unique assets that allow countries to boost investment in their economies and in climate action, and that are debt-free and that cost US taxpayers literally nothing. And that's something that, again, congressional leaders have repeatedly asked for as well. It was achieved in 2021, but more SDRs are needed. Andrés spoke about our collective ability globally to tackle climate change and debt, and again emphasized the benefits of new special drawing right issuances. And he proposed that with some accounting changes that the US can support SDRs, the use of SDRs can be vastly expanded and play a much bigger role in supporting climate action in the global south. Martín, you talked about the change, the necessary change in the structure of incentives, and how, in order to achieve that, some legal frameworks need to be adjusted around creditor compensation, and in particular in the New York jurisdiction, where most countries' sovereign bonds are bought and sold. Again, the US plays such a central role in the debt process. And Martín also spoke about the importance of changing the IMF lending rate and on ceasing to put so much in the way of debt payments on developing countries that are trying to overcome their debt difficulties. Mark noted Congress's instrumental role in achieving the biggest SDR allocation ever in August 2021, $650 billion worth, and notes that more allocations which help workers in developing countries and peers can be achieved if members of Congress continue pushing for them. So normally, many of these issues are only discussed within the confines of the IMF World Bank campus, a couple miles from here. But we brought these great experts here in Africa for two reasons. One is our realities are deeply intertwined. The US economy can't achieve its full potential without a healthy global economy. We can't save this planet if global South countries are starved of the necessary resources to meet climate goals. And the second reason that they're here and that you're here is that no serious reform can be envisioned without US support. US policymakers have played a big impact in the past and have been stepping up again, particularly since the pandemic. Here in the US, we need to remember that when the global economy is suffering, that's bad for the US economy, that's bad for US workers. We need to remember that the climate crisis requires all hands on deck. So we can't continue to tie the hands of developing countries with unsustainable debt and no stable source of resources for climate action. We need to work together or we all go down together. And ultimately, if the US doesn't step up to support the necessary reform agenda for the Bretton Woods institutions, including the IMF, then the global South is going to move ahead without the US and the Bretton Woods system. In fact, that's already happening. We're seeing it with the BRICS group of emerging market powers. But the development of effective alternatives to the Bretton Woods institutions is still many years away. Here in DC, we need to focus on the here and now and how to deal now with the looming debt crisis and the existential threat of climate change. The US Treasury appears to have turned a deaf ear to the appeals of global South countries. And that's why more US policymakers need to step up to the plate and help Treasury understand the urgency of the moment and to push it to move in a better direction on special drawing rights, on surcharges, on debt relief and restructuring, and on removing harmful austerity policies and other harmful conditionality from IMF lending agreements. And thankfully, there are a group of members of Congress that are working on that. And in fact, we can point to a lot of initiatives, but most recently, the migration and stability legislation that's being led by Representatives Kassar, Chief Garcia, Privilege Paul, Cameron Dove, and all the great work of the Global Migration Caucus. They've already come out with a resolution recently, and there's more to come. And so there's a lot that can be done from Congress, and I urge you to stay engaged on these wonky topics and to continue following all of our work, including the many great reports and articles coming out of my organization, CDPR, at cdpr.net. Okay, thank you.
All right, so we've gone a little over time, but I'm told we have the room for a bit longer, so we're happy to take questions. Anyone? Comments, pushback, anything? Yeah.
I'm over at Iyabo, and we're also facing a lot of debt from investors in Wall Street. And I think many more people would be advocating for these IMF changes and these more international changes if they knew more about them, right? But like this is a very wonky topic. And there are some ways like civil organizations involved. But I was wondering, about how to involve more people that don't have that econ knowledge, right, into this fight, so they can get involved in like activism and organizing.
Thank you. I can take a couple more.
Question for Professor Guzmán, but you have suggestions on the best way to motivate private capital to global South countries that doesn't create the same type of unsustainable debt load or potentially isn't coming with the high interest rates that we've been seeing in the past, potentially through equity investments or other ways to try to scale up.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Question, maybe for whoever wants to take it. Lots of talk about SDR rechanneling. Is that a solution? And is that something we should support?
All right, thank you. That's good. Who would like to take the question about involving people who don't necessarily have an economics background? Well, all right. I will pick up on what Dr. Pep mentioned. Is I think we need to find the real life impact ways for people to connect with these issues. So if I own a house and my insurance rates are going up, then I'm paying attention to it. And if someone can then help me make the connection to, oh, this is related to climate catastrophe, then I can start to make that connection. In a similar vein, I think with SDRs, when you can make the connection for people in the United States about how this is helpful for jobs in the United States, that's a real connection. So my advice there would be, and I suppose it's maybe advice for our organizations that are working on these issues, is that we do need to find there is a wonky audience for this, and then there are the people who need to support it. And if we want to get public support that can push Congress, whether it's the US or in other parts of the world, we need some of this pressure in Europe too. We do have to make it relatable to people and why it matters to them from their own interested point of view, as well as the sort of wider moral obligation that most of the global north should have towards supporting these initiatives in the global south. So I think you're right. You're onto the right thing, and perhaps that's homework for us to think about how we make those issues more relatable, and then do the public education to make those connections. That would be my simple answer. All right, Ms. Guzmán, you want to take the one about how we make private capital available without unsustainable debt burden?
So what we want is countries attracting good quality capital flows, not bad quality. An example of a bad quality capital flow is what we call carry trade, when there is an opportunity for arbitrage between the interest rates in domestic currency and the expected rate of depreciation of the exchange rate. That's the hot money. It moves very quickly, and it doesn't go to the real economy. It's not money that builds up more productive capacity. So for that, to begin with, domestic policies matter. Countries need to have certain regulations that discourage the flows of hot money. We know the empirical evidence is overwhelming in terms of the macroeconomic volatility that the bad quality capital flows create. But it's not just about domestic policies. The international financial system has problems. So when it comes to sovereigns borrowing in foreign currency and foreign law, they get exposed to the volatility of the ratings from the credit rating agencies. And the way institutional investors work, as you know, is that you need to meet certain criteria and requirements related to the ratings from the credit rating agencies. So when you get a downgrade, you are in trouble. That's a procyclicality of capital flows. Changing that is not easy because the official sector, the official international sector works in the same way. The IMF works in the same way. Let me give you an example of what's going on with what the surcharges that were discussed. The IMF makes income from lending to countries in crisis. It saves that money. It builds up capital. Where do you think that capital is invested? It's all in AAA securities. Okay, so the money from the countries in crisis go to BlackRock, Vanguard, etc. Right? So it adds to the procyclicality of capital flows from European nations. So ultimately, what you want is what we all want, but it's a challenge that we can't achieve with the way the international financial architecture works now. And the first point to start changing that is changing the income and lending models of the official institutions. And with that, we can have changes in the private sector, and we should also have changes in domestic policies to discourage bad quality capital flows.
Thanks. Yeah, just to pick up on one of the things you said, that currency fluctuation is such a challenge for countries. The fact that most of their sovereign debt is held in dollars or another hard currency makes it extremely challenging when there are domestic shocks in the developing world. So one of the other things that I think many groups have been pushing for in the financial institution realm is to push for models that can do local currency lending as a way to try to relieve the burden. I just want to put that point out. SDR channeling, who wants to take that?
You take that. Can I just say one thing about
Sure.
this person?
Yeah.
Because I think this is a big question that doesn't come up enough. And that is the Federal Reserve, raised interest rates 11 times since March of 2022, and then has been slow to lower them, even though inflation has returned to basically target levels. And so this is a big thing that people can understand, and possibly, okay. I mean, it has to be. I think this is something that affects Puerto Rico too, and the debt and everybody's debt. In fact, a lot of it didn't come up so much here, but the a lot of the debt burden that the developing world is facing right now is really a result of the Fed policy of which they have no control. That's another example of what Martín was talking about, the how the decisions made in the developing world affect in the rich world affect the developing world. And this is something that's going to be really huge going forward, okay? Because and I'll just speak 30 seconds more. I'm sure you guys will agree with this, but you know, macroeconomic policy is so important and it needs to be understood because we won two of the most important battles for economic policy here in the United States that anybody could win, which was fiscal and monetary policy, right? We ran those huge deficits when we needed it for a quick recovery. We had quantitative easing, which were really for the first time starting in 2009, and we did things that nobody thought were possible before, and they were, okay? And nobody knows about it. And so when they come to take it away from us, which they're already starting to do, and they're going to do more of next year, no matter who's elected, okay? That is something that people are going to have to understand. And Europe, it's even worse, in terms of the lack of understanding of macroeconomic policy that causes a lot of the right-wing politics that you see as well. So that's really big, and that's why I'm glad you raised the question of how we can reach people, because if we can't reach them on these major policies that matter the most, we're going to have a lot of trouble going forward.
Yeah. So SDR channeling, we have to go to the origin of the term. So the first time they talked about using these unused SDRs, they were referring it to SDRs reallocation or SDR recycling. The implications of those terms are completely different because reallocation means taking from one to give to someone else, or recycling actually means giving a use for them. Well, rechanneling came as a euphemism for basically lending the original SDRs. So then it's not about donating, it's not about redistributing, it's about lending. And in this case, basically replicating the same pattern of that fueled crisis. So debt-based rechanneling has been a total failure. The IMF created its own framework for rechanneling SDRs from the rich countries to the poor ones. And it's been 3 years since the SDRs were issued, and only $3.5 billion in the RST have been effectively dispersed. Out of the 650 billion, only 3. Okay, so how can you, the number is absolutely clear. It's less than 1%. And it means that it's been a total failure. And then they designed another mechanism for rechanneling, which is through multilateral development banks. The African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, they said, we're going to give these unused SDRs to these banks so that they can lend the SDRs to the countries. Sounds kind of nice, sounds kind of okay. You know how many SDRs have been rechanneled through that mechanism? 0. It's been 3 years. 0 SDRs have been rechanneled through that mechanism. So how can we spend so much energy pushing for the so-called rechanneling when we could have used all of our human energy and efforts in advocacy, in reports, in paper writing, and so on, to instead push for a new issuance? That's where the energy should be focused on. And in addition, to make those small tweaks so that donations can actually happen. That would be a good way of rechanneling, but of course, that now has these obstacles to go forward. So new issuance is definitely the way to go. And please remember, it's an obligation under the international treaties to have recurrent issuances of SDRs. It's not something that we should be begging. We should be actually requesting the fulfillment and the compliance with the international treaties. Yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a really nice chart that shows. When you have an issuance, you get the bottom block, $209 billion worth directly to the developing countries. And all this rechanneling talk that we've been hearing for years now, has only gotten $3.4 billion via the PRGT, 3.1 via the RST, which is the Climate Rechanneling Fund, and $1.0 billion worth of bilateral SDR loans. So basically nothing compared to what a new issuance gets you.
Any other questions?
Credit goes to Ivana.
Go ahead.
You had mentioned something about creation of US jobs from the SDRs, and I just wonder how that might compare, like what number, you mentioned some numbers, but I wonder if we could compare it to other job creation initiatives like the IRA that a lot of people in this room work really hard.
Yeah, it's basically bigger than the jobs created by the Inflation Reduction Act, another selling point.
Go ahead.
You had also mentioned sort of the power and the veto power that effectively the US has in the IMF. Is that desirable, undesirable? If it's undesirable, how do you change that?
Well, I think it's undesirable. You can see it, and how will it be changed? Well, I gave kind of a gradualist strategy, a reform strategy, because where we are right now, which is basically through the issuance of SDRs, you give the rest of the organization, the other 189 countries represent, well, I should say that the rich countries are basically aligned with the US. They have 60% of the vote total. So it's more than just the 85% veto on votes that need 85%. It really is almost all votes. In the last 30, 35 years, I've only seen a couple of votes that Treasury lost, 3 actually, at the IMF. And so it is really that kind of dominance. So I think this could, the ones that they lost were all the last few years. And so there is a possibility that you could build a constituency within the fund, especially from governments that understand and are willing to fight for this. But people have to choose their battles. They're not going to fight for something if they think they have no chance. That's why I see the SDR as a first step towards the kind of reform within the IMF that would grow to the point where it wouldn't be resistible. Other people might have other ideas like alternatives to the fund itself.
Yeah, if I may complement Mark's answer. So I would say that desirable or undesirable depends on whose interest you're focusing on. So it gives power to the US, but not to within the US, to the one that exerts the power at the IMF, which is the US Treasury, right? So if you have the Labor Department or the Trade Department might be different the way the power is exercised down with the US Treasury. So the reality now is that the way the US Treasury, since the end of Bretton Woods, which is basically when the IMF started to become more relevant for lending to country crisis, because we have more crises, the way power has been exercised is to favor the creditors, the private creditors, and typically to increase the payment capacity in foreign currency of a country that owes to the creditors, high interest rates. The programs push for construction, because economic contraction means to contraction of imports. So if you import less, you have more surplus to repay debts in foreign currency. But lower imports means lower demand for American goods. So that's not good for jobs in the US. Okay? So that's, I would say, if it's for the interest of Wall Street, that's desirable. For the interest of American workers, the way it works is not desirable.
I would also add that from an internationalist perspective, the Bretton Woods institutions, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but it's essentially the power of decision making is tied to how much money you're putting in the system, which is one way of looking at governance. But another way of looking at governance is who actually is using the money, and do they have much say in how these institutions make decisions? And the reality is that the vast majority of countries that actually need this money have very little say in what happens at the board level. And for that reason, then those who are richer need to be thinking about rebalancing power so that those who are using the money can also have more of the say at that level.
And I'd also like to add a bit. So the review of voting power happens every 5 years or so. The next one is supposed to end next year. And at CEPR, we put out a paper proposing that for the first time, the formula for assigning voting power at the IMF should also include a climate variable. With my colleague Ivana Vasic, we published this paper at CEPR where we propose that a climate denominator be included in the formula that would, of course, give more power to climate vulnerable countries, especially small island developing states, and would reduce the power of the great emitters, for example. So that's also something that can be on the discussion, even though we know that it's very unlikely to pass, but at least the conversation has to happen.
All right, we are on the hour. It's almost 11. So I think I'm going to draw this conversation to a close. Thank you so much to all of you for participating. It's really good to see the interest in these issues. So a round of applause to yourself. Thanks to our speakers. Can we give them a round of applause? Thank you also to CEPR for organizing and to Representative Garcia for co-sponsoring. I would end by saying that we need the United States to lead well, not just claim that they are. And this conversation is a part of helping push the US in the right direction.